Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of August 23rd, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, and happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research and Polling Director for the same Texas Politics Project.
Howdy.
So, Josh, there's a lot going on, kind of.
I guess. Yeah, geez. I don't know. It's a long list. It's a laundry list of things going on.
Well, I think for the last couple of times that we've done this, we're kind of tracking public opinion and the rise of the pandemic and its impact on people and policy and politics in the state. And I think for the last...
Shouldn't somebody?
Yeah, good one. So for the last few weeks, we've kind of said, and there's also all this stuff going on in the legislature, but they were kind of stalled out because of the Democratic quorum break. And I think a couple of times we stopped to talk a little bit about filling in, some of the blanks there and talking about some aspects of that. But, here we are. The legislature appears to be back in business after the end of the Democratic quorum break that had paralyzed the legislature for the entirety of the first special session called by Governor Abbott immediately upon the end of the regular session and which carried into the first couple of weeks of the second special session also called, of course, by the governor. As Democrats seemed to, as a group, be trying to figure out whether there was a shared strategy, and if so, what it was.
I think they're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, a state that is continuing. So, at the end of last week, enough Democrats came back to the floor of the House for the House to barely make a quorum. Though it's a matter of dispute among some Democrats and progressives, but the train's left the station. So we're going to set that dispute aside only, to note that, the threshold was even lowered by a member because there are two vacancies in the House for various reasons right now. But making a slightly reduced quorum was enough to enable the House majority to refer bills to committee and to start the process of addressing some of the agenda items that were on Governor Abbott's special session call. Though, with only 2 weeks left in the session, it's unlikely they're going to get to everything. Well, I will, note, given, the pace and the agendas and the speed with which the committees are meeting and going through their agendas, they're going to give it the college try. Not that everybody believes in college is good. Don't get me wrong.
I was to say, if the college try means 40 minutes of testimony, as opposed to
for example. So, on Monday, and then in terms of the politics to this, on Monday of this week, more Democrats returned, which, making it look in some ways as if the Democrats' efforts to derail or delay the process, at least at the state level, was played out. Now, to be fair, there was always a national political play at work here, and we'll come back to that. But in terms of seeing where the legislature is right now, the most telling thing is that the catalyst for the quorum break, the Republican-sponsored voting bill, is moving and moving with due speed, it seems to me. The House version of the bill, which differs slightly from the Senate version, passed out of committee late Monday. It's expected to go to the floor after what I would expect to be a very brief stop in the calendars committee. It probably shouldn't even take off its shoes, that bill. It's going to go in there and then get ushered out.
It's like a rolling stop, maybe.
So we think that that's going to be no later than next week. But there's a bunch else on the agenda, right? That also seems to be moving.
That's right. I think, we've sort of hinted at this before, and I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit today, but it's not as though the voting bill is the only thing on the special session call. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you know that, but the politics of it are all pointing in the same direction, which is that in addition to the voting bill, which the Democrats have, again, were willing to leave their homes in the state for months on end to derail. There's also a bunch of other stuff that, is probably, equally or very close to equally as distasteful to Democrats as that. So, we're talking about big increase in border security spending, strict regulation of what teams transgender kids can play for or try out for should they want to. Still more limitations on abortion, still more legislation talking about, curriculum related to the teaching of racism. So there's, and I think that's all of it. It's hard to tell within the broad confines of special session calls. I mean, I think there's a couple other things on there that for sure Democrats are not pleased about addressing.
Yeah, like changing the quorum breaking rules.
Well, they won't. Well, that'll never happen. I mean, we'll see. I mean, that seems pretty unlikely to happen. But I mean, I would say more so. I mean, the thing that I think of is, there's something in there that I think is probably the shell for limiting the ability to have of cities to require paid sick leave.
Right.
Things like that. So there's plenty not to like if you're a Democrat coming back.
Yeah, and I think to foreshadow or something else we'll hit on. There are a lot of things that Democrats don't like, but I think what's interesting is that not all Democrats dislike all of those things with the same intensity, and that's causing some friction right now, which we'll get to. But for now, I mean, in terms of thinking about, where things stand for the Democrats, I mean, critics of the Democrats, I mean, Republicans with a certain amount of schadenfreude, but even Democratic, critics, who of course there are always many because, that's the nature of the Democrats, internal critics, are saying, did this make any difference? And, the Democrats have an answer. How persuasive do you think it is?
Well, I think
let's look at. I guess we should, to be fair, look at the answer. Give them.
Okay. Well,
give them a fair shake.
Right. So the answer, as far as I read it, and I think the point that you're making is there's no one answer first and foremost, right? Because there are different Democrats who are sort of saying different, who are wrapping what they've done in different packages. So, but I mean, they sort of tend to center on a couple sets of arguments. Is one, this drew a lot of national attention, and I think I've heard, some say it actually reset the national conversation. Essentially, by Democrats going to Washington, it wasn't just even about Texas; it was about making sure that there was a face to Republican efforts to limit voting access across a lot of states. Texas is a big state; it was a dramatic act on TV a lot, on cable news a lot. Clearly drew attention, in a way that was not just about Texas. Same time, drew a lot of attention in Texas. I mean, this is what a lot of the news coverage around politics has been really focused on over the last, month and a half. And I would say Republicans have spent much of the last month and a half really trying to reframe the debate around the voting and election bill because of all that attention. So really, which is actually further, led to more attention. I would say additionally, it has run down some of the clock. I mean, the governor has promised to call multiple special sessions until, his priorities are passed. Now, it's not clear how many of his priorities are his 1A priorities and how many are kind of 1B, 1C, and 2 that we could maybe not deal with until the next time. But there's, there are some, I would say there's a reasonably hard deadline coming up, and it's called the election, and then redistricting is a big part of that. So ultimately, there is only 2 weeks left in the second called special session. That's going to limit how much they can do within that time period. The House is not the Senate. Even if they move stuff through committee really quickly, they're still going to have delays in getting this stuff worked out because, they're a rowdy bunch and because they just have more rules they have to follow. But also redistricting is coming up, and that's going to take a lot of time and attention. And I'm not sure that they're going to want to be dealing with the internal politics of redistricting along with the nastiness of all this other stuff at the exact same time. So I think there are some things that they've accomplished, I would say, in that sense. That would be sort of the argument, I think. Does that sound right?
I'm sitting here.
Am I missing something?
I mean, I think it's funny that, because this is only now sort of occurring to me, not really. But I mean, I think that Democrats all along have said that this was taking an ethical and moral stand that would be important to their constituents, whether they won or lost. And I think it's fair to mention that, whether it's, whether they've achieved that or not. I think, again, with all of these, I think all of these are kind of arguable in terms of, there was definitely a kind of call and response that went on between the Republicans between the Democrats that left and the governor and other Republicans, but particularly the governor, and in some ways just definitely kind of got out of hand.
Yeah,
in the sense of in the sense of the governor deciding to veto the legislative session, the legislative article of the budget and picking a fight with, seemingly unnecessarily with potentially, the entire legislature, certainly with the House.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there was something about provoking your enemy when you're, maybe at Sun Tzu or somebody, about provoking your enemy when you're weak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One might argue that they got some short-term gain out of that, but so if you're asking if there's other things that I could put on the list, if I was going to make the case, and if I don't sound persuaded, it's because I'm not entirely, but
it's
nonetheless,
funny.
I think it's fair to mention a couple of those things.
No, it's funny. I'm sitting here thinking how cynical I am, sitting here saying, oh, well, and also their constituents hate it, so they're representing their constituents.
Yeah.
Of course, that too. But, but that's right. I mean, that's important.
And I'm kind of lining up for where I want to go next a little bit, because I think that was true, but I think that's also fed some unintended consequences, given the fact that it's ending up the way it is. So, one of the big unintended consequences is that, if we focus on the House again, since that's where we're all focused right now. I mean, the Senate I don't remember when the last time the Senate met was, because they passed all the bills and they actually are getting a little bit of summer.
Yeah, they're out of Lake Austin right now.
So, well, I don't know. I guess it still smells enough like liberty out there to enjoy yourself. But, one of the unintended consequences is this has really added additional kind of, more fissures, and there's more fracturing in a House that was already fractured. And I don't even mean, just between Democrats or Republicans. I mean, it's kind of all over the place, in the sense that, on one hand, we've seen as much nasty public infighting among Democrats in the House as I've seen in a long time. I mean, look, this stuff is all, there's always a degree of this stuff going on in the background, and, the somebody punching somebody out in a caucus or something like this. But the kind of public criticism of the Democrats that came back by Democrats that didn't approve of that tactic was very direct, and it's now picked up among some of these some Democratic interest groups, and that's kind of what I was alluding to when we talked about, a lot of the other issues on the agenda are important to Democratic constituencies, but they're not of equal importance, and that's really coming out in terms of some of the criticism that the Democrats who were in the first wave or two of returning to the House are receiving. Now, look, this is on social media. We'll see if, people put their money or their candidates, their primary challenges where their mouths are on Twitter. But there are a lot of pre-registered candidates. Jeff Blaylock's Texas election source, was mentioning that the cheat sheet that they're compiling, where they compile everybody, who is expressing direct interest or is registered, has a lot of entries, and it's on both sides.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the sense that, I mean, I think we're used to what we often refer to as the dissident right. The out of power. I mean, this is it's an important part of this conversation, but we'll set aside for a second. But the out of power Republicans who are criticizing Republicans within the process, no matter how much they do for not doing enough. And this sort of national conversation, with the figurehead being, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, and this idea of, primary challenges of moderate Democrats from progressive Democrats, and sort of, the fissures that creates. And particularly, this has been more sort of in the Northeast and some other places. We haven't really seen it too much in Texas, a little bit, just because Cisneros down there in Congress, but not a lot. And, you wonder, is this going to be the catalyst for more of that? And, this is one of the many questions that kind of remains to be seen, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's kind of what I was getting at, that, I mean, it's kind of broken out in the open in a way that it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And, this is, and we're also seeing this in terms of the kind of institutional far right contention in the Republican caucus and between kind of dissident conservatives in the House, or, dissident might even be wrong in this, militant conservatives in the House and the Speaker. For those that were watching, the House floor yesterday, some of the most, three or four of the most conservative Republicans were at the back mic doing their best to, spoil the moment for Speaker Phelan, I think, in a certain way, standing back and, calling, making parliamentary inquiry after parliamentary inquiry because they want to get to punishing the Democrats, they say, right away, or at least they want to demonstrate their will to do so on camera. Now, those things are not mutually exclusive. But clearly this went from, okay, we've got a quorum, we're going to get some business done. We've worn the Democrats out their back to, the Republicans and the Republican backbenchers giving the Speaker a hard time about not being tough enough on him.
Letting them get away with it.
Yeah. And that's kind of why I call it, talking about fragmentation, that's, it's not just, the opening up of, the Democrat, this fissure, as you say, is similar to the national division between, that we're seeing in Democratic politics at the national level in Congress, but also among Republicans. But, you and I, we've talked a bit recently and been digging around on some of the backdrop to this, right? Which, doesn't explain all the institutional fighting, that has to do with institutional design in politics. But the ideological, kind of polarization of the parties in the state has a kind of interesting character that shows up in our polling, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I would, say, if I'm just describing the right for a second before I jump to the left, if you're thinking about sort of conservatism in the state, I would say the consistency of the conservative identification among Republicans is just a notable feature of Texas public opinion. And really what's kind of shifted is not, I would say the opinions of Republicans in the state, but it's actually the policy, right? And I've been saying this a lot actually recently, which is that as you get more and more conservative policy, the only way to satisfy conservative impulses is with still yet more conservative policy. And so we're starting to see some interesting, I would say light divisions on the right, but it doesn't really compare to what we see in some ways on the left. And it's not about divisions, but it's about, sort of, I think, a shift in attitudes in Texas that's sort of notable. And it really happened over the course of the Trump presidency, where when we asked Democrats, how they identify ideologically, unsurprisingly, this is Texas. It wasn't like, they were all jumping up and down screaming, oh, we're progressives, we're liberals, move the state to the left. But over the Trump presidency, there was a polarization of Democrats. And you saw many fewer Democrats were willing to identify as moderates. Many more were willing to identify as liberals, and that has maintained itself into the beginning of the Biden presidency. And we ask the question kind of directly, which is we say, to Democrats, are Democratic, so we only ask the Democrats as we ask Republicans the inverse question. But for Democrats, we say, are Democratic politicians in Texas, basically liberal enough, too liberal, or not liberal enough? And at this point, the plurality of Texas Democrats, back in 2017, 40% of Texas Democrats said that they were liberal enough. 36% said not liberal enough. Today, it was 33% say liberal enough in April 21. So that's a drop of 7 points. The share who said that they're not liberal enough increased a few points. And, and I guess 9% say too liberal now. 19% say don't know.
Right.
And so we're kind of shifting a little bit, and you're seeing these sort of
Yeah, I think to put a sharp, the sharpen that point. Basically it went from, a pretty clear plurality saying that Texas, but still not an absolute majority, 40%. Right. When 40% say you're liberal enough, and that's the most frequent response, you get the sense that that there's some stability in there. But, that dropped by 7 points in that period. Mm-hmm. And most of the migration went to not liberal enough, even though a few went to too liberal, which suggests that there are, the gravity is shifting, but it's not a wholesale rush. I mean, it's just not a big tilt, that you're, as you're seeing the kind of delayed following of the state Democratic Party and the National Democratic Party direction, to oversimplify just a little. It's not surprising that we're seeing this kind of friction a little bit more particularly as the other party moves farther to the right.
And it makes sense in the historical sweep too, right? I mean, as Democrats become more competitive here, and they're becoming more competitive, really on the backs of younger, more diverse and more urban, urban living voters in the state, you're bringing new voters into a party. I mean, I remember a couple years ago at a Tribune festival, and this is a story I'm actually telling your story. So it'll just,
perfect.
You were at a Tribune festival event with somebody, I won't say who, you can decide if you want to, as a well-known political commentator who basically was sort of saying, hey, look, the only way the Texas Democrats are going to, be successful, I think this was in 2018 maybe, is if they can appeal to moderate whites again. And this has been this was sort of a discussion in the party for a number of years. Was okay, the Democrats, they've got this difficult choice here. I mean, it's almost a Sophie choice. Like, well, we can go and try to get the moderate whites, but then we're not going to have the progressive young people and the people of color. It's like, well, or we could focus on progressives and people of color, but we're not going to have the moderate whites. And that decision, I think, has been made at this point. But I think that decision has been made with a certain, I would say at a statewide level, probably. But it has the effect that it creates that friction where you do see people saying, nope, too liberal.
Well, what's interesting about that? It's funny you would say the decision being made, because as you tell that story, which, I love being peripheral, having a walk-on roll in, but there's a funny piece to that, which is that, I think that discussion is still pretty active behind the scenes, even if the policy thrust that we see from elected officials is as you describe it, I think more clearly, more to the left, more liberal, more progressive, whatever. But there's a piece of that that's really interesting, which is, have we really seen the litmus test of that until we have more statewide Democrats who are really in, the push comes to shove position of having to balance those constituencies and balance those impulses?
I don't think we're ever going to find that litmus test, and I'll tell you why. Is because
the Democrats are never going to win again.
No, because no Democrat is going to win. No. I mean, I think it's partially that, but I mean, no, because no Democrat is going to win by appealing, as a moderate at this point. I mean, I think we've seen.
But people win running one way and then govern another way. That has been known to happen.
But there's a specific technical reason I mean that. I don't mean that it's not possible. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of, let's say older school, usually white male Democratic politicians run for statewide office, or at least I'll say try to get the nomination to run for statewide office over the last 10 years with pretty limited success if there's competition. I think the issue is I don't think you can run as a moderate Democrat appealing to sort of, the moderate white voters in the state and get the kind of funding you need to be competitive in that position. I think at this point, the money is behind the progressive candidate. So I think that's where I would see it being difficult to imagine how it happens from a technical standpoint.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Well, I just thought of it and just said it.
I mean, I think it depends.
I might be wrong.
It depends a little bit on, how you sort of understand, who the candidates are going to matter, to some degree, but also, where that money is coming from. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting about that is that it does, I mean, something that buttresses that argument is that it's likely that no Democratic candidate is going to be the breakthrough candidate here without outside money.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that outside money is likely to be more liberal.
Yeah.
But there are also, interesting questions about the kind of, the political economy of raising money as a Democrat, within the universe of Democratic voters. And that's not. And so, I mean, I think part of what I've always been unpersuaded by the, we got to appeal to those moderate white voters. I mean, I don't think there are that many of those moderate white voters. I think white voters are probably, we should look at this, as closely polarized as everyone else.
But it also, it sort of assumes that the Democrats are already competitive and that they're solid with their base and that they can just appeal to kind of the voters that they need to get them across the finish line. But we know from our own polling, we know from exit polling, the majority of Democratic voters in Texas are people of color. They're women. And that, and that kind of makes up, again, that makes up the majority. And then you have about, probably about a third who are, white liberals, and then a mixture of the rest. So make up probably about the other 20%.
Well, and let me complicate that factor with one more thing, which is that if you think about, and again, this is not true on all issues, but on many, take, for example, the policing issue, the white liberals in the party are, as a group, tend to be on many issues more liberal than are the Hispanic and Black voters.
They tend
certainly than the Hispanic voters.
If their interest is in winning elections, they tend to be a little bit out over their skis.
So, so that's another piece here. So we should wind this up because we're running out of time. But I mean, I think to circle back to where the Democrats are. I mean, I think, the state of play for Democrats' hopes of having something to show for this, I think, are still in the hands to some degree, in the final analysis of what's going to happen in Washington, because, they're going to be able to make the argument that they moderated the voting bill, which is going to pass. But there's still going to be some things in there that Democratic constituencies are going to hate, particularly those that are focused on elections and voting law. There is nothing in this bill that is going to make Progress Texas or the Texas Civil Rights Project feel like, they really brought home the bacon on this, right? I mean, I think, not to say that those people are unreasonable. They will recognize that the bill was worse in its first instantiation back in mid-May or mid to late May.
And that's the new argument now that I think is kind of starting.
Yeah, right. No, and I think that's what, and it's good that that's the new argument because that's what they got.
Right.
But, as we speak, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are trying to move the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would then give, a new set of legal tools, at least as written now, to Texas Democrats to challenge laws like this, like they used to be able to prior to Roberts Court's decisions that gutted the Voting Rights Act. So I think that's hovering out there, but that's also, I don't know how much you've been following the national stuff, but, there has been some brutal fighting going on inside the Democratic caucus at the national level. The latest reporting today seemed to be that the speaker had once again gained the upper hand, as a lot of the insiders had kind of predicted she would. Interestingly enough, the big meeting that was being held today was not being held in the speaker's office. It was being held in Steny Hoyer's office, who is, the second ranking Democrat behind Speaker Pelosi, at one time a contender to be speaker, a competitor. But also by his nature, a much more moderate Democrat, even though he's been, a team player for the Democrats and all this, not to be confused about that. But I think it's telling that his good offices are being used for the final negotiations, hammering this out. Now, the immediate thing is the relationship between the big spending bill and the infrastructure bill. But the voting rights legislation got wrapped into that as a way of them trying to put pressure on the moderates, which I thought was politically very admirable and smart, and especially ruthless, which I kind of admired. And so I think we need to watch that, because it's hard, to look at where we are now and think that this session is going to end without them passing that voting bill, and without some Republicans are out for some blood, and I think that in the Texas House, and I think there's going to have someone's going to have to pay a price, and it's going to be interesting to see who they are. As you and I have talked about, a lot of the people that broke away early from the Democratic resistance were people that were closer to management in the House and had more to use, people that had chairmanships, people that had positions, or people that had been part of the effort to get Phelan elected speaker instead of another Republican. And I think we have not seen all of the politics of that play out yet.
I doubt it.
And so the next couple of weeks will be very interesting to see how that develops. We are at a couple minutes past 30 minutes, so I'm going to thank Josh, thank our folks in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. We talked about a lot of data today. I urge you to look at the data we talked about and much more at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And so thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.